an architecture media podcast, produced on Bunawurrung country.
Welcome to Design Speaks Weekly, a podcast that explores the biggest stories in Australian architecture and design. I'm your host, Georgia Burks, and today I'm joined by Lee Hillam, founding principal of Sydney-based architecture practice, Dunn Hillam. Lee shares her perspective on what good design really means. But first, here are the latest news headlines from Architecture AU.
In the news this week, JPW and Aspect Studios' design for Sydney's future Town Hall Square has been unveiled, featuring a circular paving pattern and a central water element surrounded by a grove of native trees. In Melbourne, the proposed demolition of a Roy Grounds building has been opposed by a recent petition, which has attracted more than 1,400 signatures, along with support from academics and historians urging that the building be listed on the state's Heritage Register. And entries are now open for the Australian Institute of Architects Dulux Study Tour, which is set to depart in May next year. For the full stories and more news, visit architectureau.com. I'm Lucia Amies. It's Tuesday, August 18.
Lee Hillam is a seasoned design critic. Her experience as an architect, a reviewer for national publications such as Architecture Australia, and as chair of the State Design Review Panel for the Government Architect of New South Wales, has sharpened her eye for what makes a successful architectural outcome. In this episode, Lee unpacks how we justify a project's merit and explores the tension between subjective and objective evaluation in design. Hello, Lee, and welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Georgia.
Lee, architects often talk about good design as though it's obvious, but it can be surprisingly difficult to define. When you walk into a project or see a design concept for the first time, what are the things that tell you whether it's a successful design outcome, and is this what defines good design to you?
It's interesting that you start with an idea that architects don't see it as a question and everyone else does see it as a question. I think we've got to remember that we've got a very long, rigorous degree that teaches us to be critical thinkers, and often we forget that not everyone has had that education. So the fact that we all see it as something that's obvious and others don't, I think we do need to keep that in our mind when we're talking to people who don't have an architecture degree in their background. What I think essentially good design is, what it comes down to is how it satisfies the brief. So the brief then, in my mind, becomes the ground for contention and rigorous disagreement or, investigation. And because if you have everyone on the same page agreeing what the brief is, then deciding whether something is good design becomes quite simple, because you're all aiming towards the same thing, so then you can all assess it against that same thing. The problem comes when you have everyone has a different idea of what the brief is. What does this building need to achieve? If we're talking strictly about architecture, what does it need to achieve? And it's very possible and very likely, and in fact, right and good that everyone has different requirements or different ambitions or different hopes for every architectural project that comes along. So it's not surprising that sometimes you get to a point where people are trying to decide whether something's good design or not, and you get a bit of disagreement. I think mostly that comes from because people haven't either understood what the brief was or they haven't agreed on what the brief was. I actually did a little, informal poll of a few architect friends on this question, and it's a commonly held view that architects are very comfortable with the idea that good design can be assessed. You can be objective about what good design is. And there's so many fantastic bits of work that have been done where people will put a framework around how you assess good design. I love and have always loved for a long time Dieter Ram's principles of good design. I'm sure you're very familiar with that. Dieter Rams being an industrial designer who was an architect, did train as an architect, but was an industrial designer for the Braun company. And he has his 10 principles of good design, which I look at all the time because they're very succinct. And then the other one that I think is actually really useful in a very much more local context is the New South Wales Better Placed document, which, is designed for non-architects to be able to understand and assess whether something is good design. And I think the big clue in the Better Placed document is the word better gets used over and over and over again. So if you're thinking, is this good design? One of the questions is it better? Is it better than the status quo? Is it better than other examples?
So it's like strategically used, that word, better.
It's very strategic, and very strategic that they've used it repetitively. Each of the principles in Better Placed starts with better.
It goes to show how powerful language is. And I'm thinking about, as you sort of mentioned earlier, architects have got this rigorous education that starts from university and maybe a little bit earlier for some who might be lucky enough. And then thinking about language where architects, politicians or clients might not have that. How do you talk about these ideas of design quality to people who aren't architects or aren't design educated?
Yeah, I think that can be really helpful just to talk. The other thing that this word better brings up is that it uses the idea of it is that it's better than something else, right? And this is the simplest and easiest way to get people to understand evaluating something on good design is comparative evaluation. So it's a very simple idea. If you can't decide whether one thing is good, you put it next to another thing and decide if it's better than the other thing. And it's a simple process, but it's what we all do when we're making decisions. You're looking at one thing in isolation and you're just trying to decide if that's good. If you have nothing to compare it to. So if you've got no experience of buildings in your entire life, I don't know how this happened. Let's imagine. You've got no experience at all, and you can't then judge the one that you're looking at. I mean, it's not true that it's possible to have no experience of buildings. So you've always got something in your history, your own house you grew up in, you've got experiences of buildings all the way through your life. You can compare that to the thing you're looking at and decide whether it's better. It's one of those things where it sounds so dumb and simple that it almost feels like you've got to, surely there's more to it. But there isn't. And this is a really, really useful tool for anyone to decide on, if you're trying to make a judgment on what is the best outcome. In your own design, you're looking at a couple of different options for something you're working on yourself, and you lay them out and you go, well, make a judgment in comparison, one to another. Do a comparative evaluation. And that is how we're doing it, even if we're not doing it explicitly, because we're doing it using experience, our own experience of other buildings. So you, having seen thousands and thousands of buildings and having to have an opinion about them in your work, have this huge database of knowledge of other things you've seen, and you're using that to look at the next building and think, okay, is this better than other things I've got in my database?
That's exactly right. Yeah, it's each year we're sort of seeing a new wave of projects come through and we're measuring them, I guess, to what we've seen in the previous year. I want to bring up the conversation back to, we're speaking about objectivity and subjectivity and thinking about comparison as well. I think about design competitions, and they are a way of procuring the best project for a particular brief and site. So if design is inherently subjective, can a jury be objective?
A design competition is a really good test case, because I've sat on many, many design competition juries, and it's very rare that you don't get a consensus. So you have 6 architects in a room, and you would have heard a million times from other parts of the industry, architects are always disagreeing with each other. And that might be the case, but the things that you're disagreeing with are minor details. There's a consensus in almost every competition I've been in as to which is the best outcome. And we've done that by comparative evaluation. We've looked at all of the other projects. And I would also say in a competition, you've got 5 or 6 projects to look at. They're all good. They're all really good design. So it's quite, the conversation is at a fairly sophisticated level to work out what is the better one. You use comparative evaluation to do that, and you arrive at a consensus almost always. So it's not subjective in that sense. I think what happens when people think that design is subjective is that they're mixing up style. They're mixing up style and taste with good design. And style and taste is fantastic. Love it. Great. Fashion, colour, all of these things. I like one thing, you like a different thing. That's great. But that's not really good design, or it's just the icing on the cake of good design. So I think that's what people see is architects arguing about the icing on the cake when there actually is a consensus on the cake itself. I actually wrote this down. Dieter Rams' principles, when he talks about aesthetics, he says good design is aesthetic, but he also says only well-executed design can be beautiful.
In a feeling sense? Is that what he means?
Well, no, I think there is a way that a building that is well executed will just hang together so beautifully. You could break that down and explain exactly why, but then people will have arguments about essentially like it's red or it's blue, or
the composition of the facade or something.
Yeah, well, I mean, I do think composition can be very objective because you're looking at something that's either a calming pattern or it's, back to the brief. Was the designer of this building asked to make a very exciting kind of provocative building? So then, the facade might be, a lot. There might be a lot going on. Or, is this building's role to sit really nicely into its context, which might be a heritage context, to be polite, to have grace? Then that's a different composition and a different facade because that's what the brief has asked for. There's a lot of architects, I would say, I really like their work. I really like their process. I love the buildings to be in, and then I'll look at the outside of the buildings and think the icing on that particular cake is not for me. But I will still defend those buildings and say that's good design because in Dieter Rams' principles in Better Place, there's 7 of those, there's 10 of Dieter Rams. They're going to tick the box for me on 9.5 of the 10, and they're going to satisfy the brief. I don't think good design is subjective, but I do understand why people think it is.
That's really interesting. And then also to hear how or where architectural beauty or composition sort of comes into that. You're sort of saying it can be a result of all of the others, but it can also be the icing on the cake.
It can be directly driven by the brief, I think.
Lee, one of the biggest challenges of our time, as you know, is climate change. And we know the design and construction industry has a direct impact on this issue through waste consumption and carbon emissions. When it comes to awarding good design, should we be giving merit to architecture that does not consider its environmental impact today?
Absolutely not. I suppose you want a longer answer than that. No, I think that really points to what good design is. It's imperative in the brief of every building right now that we are careful with our resources, that we are doing everything that we can to make sure the operational costs of buildings are as low as they can be. So whether or not the client put that in the brief is irrelevant to me because the planet put that in the brief, and so if it hasn't considered those things, or if it's been willfully ignoring those things, it hasn't made its best efforts to reduce things like concrete and carbon in lots of other ways, then no, I think that's a black mark against it in terms of assessing it for good design.
It sort of goes back to also what you were saying earlier, like good design is a result of the brief and I guess the context. And the context today is the fact that we are in an era of severe climate impacts and change, and that is reshaping architecture and the building industry and what we need to deliver. So I can see that for sure. You've written a lot for Architecture Australia, and I know you're also a practitioner. Has writing about architecture made you a better designer, or perhaps a more critical one?
I think writing is a great process. I don't know if it works for everyone. It works for me to write in order to process my thoughts. So writing about other people's architecture is, I find, quite challenging, actually. I find having an opinion to be hard work, unlike some people. But I'm always in awe of people who can just, have an opinion about something, off the cuff. I find that to go to talk to an architect about a building and visit a building and have the luxury of asking them about their process, it is a bit of a privilege, and it helps sit my work in the world of architecture, because I can hear similar challenges are arising. I can see how they've addressed unexpected parts of the brief. So it's an enjoyable but difficult process, I would say, to write a review of another building.
And I also find that when I'm reviewing a project, when I do have those opinions, I'm also asking myself to justify why, in a way, and explain why I think that way about a project, whether it's a positive or a negative. Do you feel the same?
Oh, yeah, I feel the weight of having an opinion very, very keenly, that I can't say anything at all that I can't justify. And it's sort of a classic thing that maybe, you get told when you're a kid, that if you can't say something to someone's face, you shouldn't say it, even if it's a criticism, and I also think that there's not much point in writing a review where the audience is other architects, where it's all it's going to say is, how wonderful this is. You need to actually try and unpack what the brief was, what the challenges of the brief were, and why this is assessed as being a good outcome. If I do think it's a good outcome, why I think it's a good outcome. It is tricky to untangle your own thoughts in writing, but it's a worthwhile thing to do.
I agree. And I think all of that provides context into why the building ended up with that result too.
Yeah. I mean, it's not that you say, oh, this was a really challenging brief, so the fact that this is a mediocre building is okay because the brief is so challenging. It's not that. It's that the brief was particular and specific, and the building is therefore particular and specific.
Lee, I could talk to you for a lot longer than we've got today about this topic, but we've come to the conclusion of this episode, so I'd like to ask you, what is a piece of advice that you keep returning to?
Well, this actually does really relate to how do you assess good design, and it was something, my first and possibly only real job working for another architect was for Richard Plastre, which was, a great privilege and a great joy. And he would say always in investigating his own work and when we were working together, that if you've got an answer if you found a solution or an answer to a particular design problem, it should actually answer 3 problems. So one answer, 3 problems. And that's how you assess whether it's the right answer. So if you're assessing your own work, you're looking at something and go, should I go, down this way or down this way? And if one of those routes can just address more than one issue of the design, then you're on the right track. So that's something that I am constantly coming back to, is this idea that one answer should take out 3 problems.
I think that's a really great bit of advice, because then it's not creating any more problems as well.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Lee, it was a pleasure to talk to you today, and definitely let's keep talking about this topic of what even is good design. So thank you for joining me.
Thanks, Georgia.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode. If you're enjoying this podcast, be sure to subscribe, share, or leave a rating. I'm Georgia Burks, and this has been Design Speaks Weekly. Design Speaks Weekly is produced on Boon Wurrung country. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture.